Hello everyone, and welcome back to Durham Ventures. Today, I'm joined by Vijay Rajendran, a founder, investor, and executive coach who spent the last 2 decades helping early-stage entrepreneurs raise capital and grow into confident, resilient CEOs. Vijay has led global portfolio value at 500 Global, advised thousands of startups at Republic, and now works with founders around the world through GAI Ventures and his coaching practice. He's also the author of The Funding Framework, Secure Startup Funding with Confidence, which is a book that breaks down the fundraising process into clear, actionable steps, from choosing between equity and debt to crafting a strong pitch and navigating investor relationships. In this episode, we're diving into that exact framework. We'll break down how students can use the resources they already have to start meaningful investor conversations, build long-term relationships, and choose the right funding strategy, whether it's equity, debt, or something in between. If you're a student founder looking for a cleaner, more confident way to raise your first round, this episode is packed with practical insights you won't want to miss. All right, let's get into it. Hope you all enjoy. All right, Vijay, thank you so much for hopping on Dormer Ventures. So happy to have you here. Really looking forward to this exciting episode.
It's my pleasure, Zaki. Thank you for having me on the pod.
Of course, I'm looking very, very forward to it. Vijay, before going to the main gist of this episode, which is, per the title, The Fundraising Playbook You Wish You Had Sooner, right? I want to first talk a little bit about yourself. How did you get to, where you started all the way to here? What led you into the world of startups and coaching and eventually writing the funding framework?
Thank you, Zaki. I mean, it's a good question because a lot of my experiences came from not having any playbook and coherent way of thinking about these things early on. So, I was exposed to startups when I was an undergraduate and had a great summer internship working in a venture leasing company. And I got to look at different startup business models, understand how they would be funded and so forth. But these were companies that had already raised venture capital, right? And so what kind of happens before that is very different than what happens after that moment. And my experience subsequently, working in tech in New York in the days of the dot-com bubble, subsequently spending time in San Francisco, building first an e-commerce company, and then building a bunch of companies in fintech, and then working in venture capital for a number of years at 500, starting accelerators and incubators with corporate partners around the world, and then leading portfolio value, which consisted of helping companies fundraise in addition to providing them with customer connections and great community in addition to capital. It really made it clear, people are just, exposed to lots of information, but really without clarity of how to apply it. And therefore, I wanted to really focus on the 10% of the time I got to spend with our portfolio companies helping founders through difficult things. And fundraising is one of them, but it could also be a co-founder issue. It could be working on navigating sales for the first time. And so there are a lot of this learned skills. And this is one of those skills. And you don't have to figure it out for yourself. And so that's part of why, a playbook it needs to exist. And that's why the funding framework exists, with an effort to demystify and provide an idea that you need great process and great systems in order to be effective and not just have good luck or be in the right place at the right time.
That's wonderful. And, after taking a look at the funding framework, it being only 99 cents is such a testament to you looking to give this information for as affordable as possible, making sure that it's accessible to everyone, right? I really think that, like you said, you didn't have that playbook, when you were starting out, and just the ability for students and student founders to have that now, especially in your book, you talk to people who are in the industry, you were talking to people who have these experiences, whether they're experiences that were constructive towards their career or maybe, destructive and a lesson they wish they had learned. And I think that that's so important. So to all of our listeners, make sure to check it out. I'll put all the information in the show notes. So they'll
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, and I decided this year in launching the book, I was just going to make it as affordable as possible. And that's why, yes, the ebook is just 99 cents. A lot of people, however, enjoy the paperback and copy versions. I have one right here. Really the idea is like this should be in everybody's hands. And, there's plenty of knowledge out there on the internet, and you can just like fill your day reading X and watching YouTube and like feel like, oh, I'm learning stuff, but you're just like filling your mind with a lot of information, and not sure how to synthesize it. This is being synthesized, and there's expert quotes and insights and stories, and there's real stories from real founders that I share here. Their names have been changed, but generally, the knowledge that is here is to be, with the least barriers to entry, to navigate this landscape of fundraising, should it be appropriate for your business.
Definitely. That's amazing. And so this episode will cover essentially the four-part structure of the funding framework. However, before going into each part, can you briefly walk us through that four-part structure?
Yeah, of course. There are four pieces to the funding framework. The first is great storytelling. The second is organization. So how you structure your materials and your plan and your schedule and things like that. And then comes outreach. And so you're running a process, and then you're thinking of the outreach to investors, much like an enterprise sale. And it's done in a thoughtful way, and building a connection between what your product is and the market going after and their thesis. And you're giving them the opportunity to join you on this journey, more than anything else. And there's lots of strategies in here in terms of how to manage a VC or some angel investor meeting, and how to think about different groups and that sort of thing. And the fourth part after outreach is closing with confidence, because a lot of people get to the finish line and then mistakes happen, and the ball gets dropped. And what I think matters here is that you have a system and a plan to project manage the closing of your company. And I even have a checklist on my website at mystartupsystem.com of things that you can have in order to close, in order to do things like have a complete data room, and so on and so forth. And so clear plans, checklists, processes, how you run your fundraise, and how you prepare your materials, and the thoughtfulness and completeness of that is an insight into how you want to run your business. And so that is really important for the for founders to understand.
Definitely. And so, hopping into the first part, as you mentioned, storytelling, kind of just laying out the groundwork, what makes storytelling so important and essential for student founders?
Storytelling is really important because you're trying to do a few things when you are explaining your business, and that is, what you're doing and why it matters and why now. And too often, if you have started a startup as a student, you're just solving a problem for yourself or people like you, and you're tinkering away. And how this gets to be something much bigger, and your purpose isn't going to be obvious to other people. And so you want to make that clear. And for people who kind of grok what's out there in the world, you think it's like a box checking exercise sometimes, like, oh, I just need to state the problem and the solution and the market, it's really big and all of that. When in fact, people need to understand as tangibly as possible, what it is that you do and to whom it matters, and how that's, something that's really relevant. Why? Because when you use the hero's journey, or when you use the way of telling a story that describes your customers or your users' pain, then it becomes really vivid for the investor who may not relate to that at all. And that way you get their attention, and that's really important. You also become more authentic, and I think that's something that Gen Z founders are really good at, is just being themselves. But when it comes to pitching their company, they suddenly think, oh, I need to like act or sound like whatever a CEO is supposed to be or something like that. And I don't think that's a good idea when, your authenticity and uniqueness and credibility is a way to stand out and be really special. So I would really suggest that to get people's attention, but for a purpose, not just to have their attention for attention's sake, but to be memorable because you want to be getting that call back. You want to be scheduled for, a second meeting to meet the rest of the firm or to get introduced to other investors who might be connected to a particular angel investor you're meeting and that kind of thing.
Of course. And, now that we've established the importance, what makes a good story or what makes a great storyteller?
I think the best stories I've heard often put the customer at the center of the story, and then makes your product or service the thing that makes them able to overcome whatever challenges they have. And so what you don't want to do is tell a story about me and I did this and I'm so great and then this happened. So this is why I built the thing. And so it's turned out to be really useful. And we have 1,000 people at my college or university, like using it. And that's more about your journey. But if you tell a story about that is really intriguing about how, you know, the every day this person spends hours and hours trying to get information out of this system and then they put it in Excel and they copy it to another system and they could be doing this other thing and the business cost is this and there's a million other companies like that and you kind of explain something that makes it look like, of course, we should just move data from A to B, right? To pick a simple example, and this sort of these wasteful steps shouldn't exist. So, like, if you're explaining efficiency, you then talk about how now this person, like, they spend their time reviewing, and they have AI to help them like orchestrate and manage the data, or an agent that helps them to review an insurance claim or something like this, which means customers are happy, things are being responded to quickly. There's more benefit to in one way or another, and it's really clear whether your product is a vitamin or whether your product is a painkiller. Because people want to grasp that very quickly, and to the extent that it's a painkiller, that it was transformative and it got people back to doing what they really want to do. And you tell that in terms of a real customer story or a real user journey, and how there are thousands or millions or whatever more people like that, and they're growing every day, and they're finding you, and you want to find them. So, that's kind of like teeing up the investor to ask a lot of questions about, well, what did they do and how much did they pay and, how many more people are there and how are they finding you? And right. And so you then have created a whole different type of interaction. You have a dialogue, and that dialogue is really what you want. You want to have a conversation, not just go slide by slide or, stand on your soapbox and pitch people. You want to be having a conversation about two things that now suddenly you went from one person trying to convince the other person to be interested, to both sides, like having something to discuss and having that shared connection and curiosity about what happens next in this story. Well, that's what we get to do together if you join us on this journey and join us as an investor.
I love that. So from your words, it's what it sounds like is that it's more about kind of painting a picture for the investors in a way that's really tangible and, something that they can remember, right? It doesn't have to be the most, cinematic story. One really big misconception that I hear a lot from my peers is that, after you watch The Social Network or learn about some of the most amazing startup stories from all these unicorns, right? You assume that your story has to be this movie worthy, Oscar winning, story that can captivate audiences. It's more about, like we just spoke about, it's more about how do you tell the story, right? How do you appeal to your audience, which is investors. I think that's fantastic. Kind of segueing from that, I want to hop into the next section on organization, right? In terms of organization in general, I just want to hear from you to start things off for this section. What are the biggest mistakes you see early stage founders make when organizing their fundraising process in general?
So organization includes having a bunch of content and being ready there. And then it also means, mapping out the process. I think on the content side, let's say it's a slide deck, or, you want to have different types of materials for sending people out as a teaser and other things for running the meeting, and then more materials to have in your data room, which is a collection of key assets like yes, your slides, also your team bios, any IP you have, maybe representative customer lists, like different types of things that kind of give people insight into the business. And people are going to review in the way they analyze your business before investing. Separately, there's going to be this need to map out the process. What you don't want to do is be continuously fundraising. Fundraising takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and it can be a huge distraction. And what you really want to do is be building a product, serving your customers, creating an awesome business that you're excited about and others want to come and work with you on, right? That's it. The point is the business. Capital is not the goal. It is just a tool. It is something that allows you to create what is possible. So when you look at it that way, it is something that isn't a distraction. It's actually very important, and you need to take it seriously. And it's one of your priorities as a founder and CEO. But how you approach it means you can't be doing it all the time. So create a process and say, okay, we're going to be taking first meetings for a particular chunk of time, and then we're going to be taking second meetings, and then we're going to finalize. We want to have a lead by this time, create momentum, go into due diligence, close out the round, and do all of this in a matter of somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks instead of over months and months and months. Particularly as fundraising is seasonal. So right now it's the summer. It's hard to get in touch with people. You can have conversations saying we're planning on raising, eventually, but just want to get to know you. And that's fine. There can be a few coffees and meetings and things like that to form relationships. But generally, you're going to have a season from Labor Day to Thanksgiving and the New Year to, Easter time, and then spring through or early summer. But yeah, right now as we're recording this in July, between the 4th of July and Labor Day, there's much less deal flow, although there's plenty of stuff in the news. Generally speaking, there is a season in which you can capture and really leverage momentum, and that's something to note. So again, your process needs to fall in the calendar at a good time, and another reason why you don't want to drag it on into the off season.
100%. And you've really been underscoring, this idea of the importance of essentially your roadmap, right? And from what it sounds like, it can be really complicated, right? It gets to the point where you have to look into things in a seasonal perspective. Where are you in the year? What does your industry look like this time of year? When is the right time to be talking to people versus building versus actively raising? For a student founder, this can be very overwhelming. And I'm curious, how can those founders who may not have the most experience with creating this fundraising roadmap, how can they start, whether that means gaining knowledge on this, on this realm, or, how do you recommend that students start creating their own fundraising roadmap in
Yeah. I have some examples in the book of what that looks like week by week. And then, use checklists, have a system where, we're doing everything in 2 week sprints. So you don't have to understand today exactly how you're going to run the closing process. But you're going to have a first, and this takes us to the next part of the funding framework, your outreach list. And this is people who you've already researched, are a good match because you're on thesis for them. And that is how you reduce. Like the thing that people often talk about is, yeah, I took 100 meetings before I had my first investor, right? And sometimes, that's the right answer. But other times, maybe you're taking 100 meetings because you're not really prioritizing the folks whom are interested in your space, your stage, and keen to lead around. Because otherwise, you're just taking a bunch of meetings with folks who, for reasons that are perfectly normal, mean they cannot write that check to you today. This is maybe a way for to some extent you practice on some of those folks, but generally, you want to run a tighter process with a finite group of people who get what you're doing and are open and ready to invest in businesses that look like yours. So there are some people who are never going to invest in first-time founders or in student founders or in, a marketplace or a healthcare product, right? Because that's just not what they do. So why are you talking to them, right? In the same way that if you were selling a product, you wouldn't talk to people outside your customer segment, right? So once you take that sort of outbound outreach mindset, it actually shrinks the world to a place where it's a lot more manageable.
Definitely. And I wanted to touch back on a point that you had made previously about the idea of capital not being your business, but rather simply being a tool to be used as leverage, right? I was curious about that because a lot of student founders, when they start, their immediate goals are just getting fundraising or getting investor attention, whereas sometimes it might not be the time. Maybe it's time to build rather than funding, maybe it's time to build, instead of trying to raise capital. This is more of a high level question, not specifically geared to the organization part of the funding framework. However, I was curious from your experience, how should student founders assess whether it's really time to start raising capital?
So, the best time to raise capital is just after you've had some important traction that changes or shows you hitting a key growth rate that matches what investors would invest in. So the best way to raise money is to be investable. That's how you get investors, right? So your growth rate is there, the product is shipped, something's happened. Oh, and by the way, we don't just want this money so we can continue what we're doing. Your capital buys you something. It buys you an even better, bigger company because we're going to add this new product, add this to the team, do something that goes into a new market and so forth, and becomes 10x bigger every time. And so people are wanting to see the potential of what you can do, but also understand exactly how you have a plan to use the money. And that's one of those things where developing a financial model, even if it's wrong, is really key because I think it was Eisenhower who said plans are useless, but planning is indispensable, right? So you have gone through this mental exercise to explain what you're doing and that you're going forward with clarity to be a good steward of their capital and someone who's just going to create a lot of value with it.
Definitely. That's wonderful. I know that was more high level, but I think that's something that a lot of our, listeners may have in mind as they begin to step into that phase of, raising capital. And so you hinted at this, but the next stage in the funding framework is the outreach stage, right? I think that for a lot of our listeners, this is the one that they want to learn the most about just because outreach as a college student can be a very weird space. For example, a lot of them might not have many connections, especially in the investor and VC space to start out with. What's your advice to a student founder that, you know, maybe doesn't have any VC connections but wants to start reaching out?
Cold outreach doesn't always fail, but it usually doesn't work. What I mean is there will be this 0.1% of the time outcome where cold outreach is successful. But, what you want to do ideally is have warm intros. And how you get to warm intros is through founders that an investor has backed already, a trusted referral, which can be a professor or, even through a customer connection or something like that. It can be, pointing to social proof, because maybe you won a startup competition or you were mentioned in media someplace, and then you refer to an alum or someone else who's actively investing in companies and say, I would love feedback on what we're doing, and share with you, why we're excited about this, and say, you know, is it all right if I share some materials? Would you oppose to a 15-minute meeting to just like get your thoughts on our trajectory and where we're heading? Why? Because when you're a student, people are, more open to supporting you, right? Even if it's not financial. And one one of the cliches is you want um, if you want advice, ask for money, and if you want money, ask for advice. And so asking for people's thoughts and advice, not that you have to take it, you need to actually have a good filter to take advice, or not. But but in fact, to just open up the network you have from zero to something, to an N of something, and then that gets bigger and bigger as, you can just say, I end the conversation, even if they say, I I wouldn't invest in this, or this isn't what I do. It's like to ask what needs to be right with what we're doing in order for, folks like yourself to invest, and who are we not talking to that, in your opinion, that we should be? And people love to tell you, like, oh, you need to go meet these people who do these things, and then, say, what would you be opposed to, to forwarding an introduction, and you better write a good forwardable email to that person that they can just hit forward, send, and say like, hey, talk to Zaki, he's doing something super cool in this space. I know that it matters to you. And that's how, connection by connection, relationship by relationship, you build something, that can, open the door to future fundraising. Why? Because what you're doing, requires you to build trust, and fundraising is a trust building exercise. So if you come into it saying like, "You never heard of me, and I'm not credible, and I'm not doing anything to earn credibility," you're not going to build trust, and instead it's going to be clearly all you perceive it as, you have money and I want to, and I want some of it, which is not the relationship that any angel investor or VC wants to have. So that is, like, I think the biggest, mindset shift. And the best way to have that mindset is not to, just read a book or listen to a podcast.
That's very, very valuable advice, especially the part where you kind of mentioned how, you know, investors aren't simply just a one-stop shop, simple, connection to say, hey, can I have some money? And then it's a yes or no from there. They're also a person to help build trust in the network, to help be a stepping stone for your network, in general, right? It's more than just simply, hey, can I have some money? All right, no, thank you. To the next investor, right? It's
Yeah. This is not slow swipe left, swipe right. This is not like I'm going, on my phone and applying for a credit card.
Exactly. And I think that's a huge misconception nowadays. I think that the idea of angel investing and venture capital is, you know, it's so misunderstood and misconstrued that a lot of student founders tend to, just like you mentioned, they just assume that fundraising is just swipe left, swipe right. They don't assume it to be, like you said, it's a trust building process, right? It's an exercise, right? And I think that's a very valuable point for our listeners to take home. And, you know, when student founders are, speaking to these investors, and like you said, it's all about building trust and credibility, right? How do student founders who maybe, don't have the level of credibility that they want to be at yet, how can they still establish credibility with that individual when they just might not be there yet?
Yeah. When when you're a student, you're a learning machine. And that's awesome, because what you can do is read what the investor has written, look at, investments that they made on look at Crunchbase. If you're a student, you get access to PitchBook, which is a wealth of information. And also like maybe see interviews, whatever, and the things that they've done, so that you have a perspective of and look at their LinkedIn and just say and say, I'm working on this problem. I know this problem matters to you because of your career, because of what you've written, because of what you've said, right? And match their thesis with your calling and your interests and the what and the business you're trying to build. Because now you have taken the time to draw that connection and explain the relevance. So even if you don't have any patents and you have or you haven't had an internship yet, it doesn't matter, right? You have drawn great significance between what you're working on, and the thing where you're investing your time and what this other person has already said matters to them in the world.
Definitely. No, that's fantastic. And, going on to the last, stage of the funding framework and closing off, well, that's the perfect mention of the last part, closing, right? Can you tell us a little bit about closing? What makes a good close? Why is a good close important? How to not, as you mentioned previously, how to not drop the ball?
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think project management in this case means there are certain steps, there are certain people involved, and there's certain things that need to happen in terms of signatures on key documents, knowing who is responsible and involved, and bringing your team in to help you. It's not just like, yes, you were the project manager of your closing if you were the founder and CEO, but your team can support in terms of signatures and wires. Those are the two things, right? In order to close, there's going to have to be current and existing investor approvals. If people are using their pro rata, which means like how much they get to reinvest in a future or next round, then that they have exercised that. And if you're waiting for money to come in, like you have actually checked and told people in advance and communicated and reminded them and over communicated so that they can say like, oh, you know what? I'm going to be in the mountains, or I'm going to be like on a beach someplace, and I won't have access to this, or I'm not bringing I don't have my computer. Something will happen where they say someone can't sign, or they can't like organize the wire, or they're finishing building their house or going through something personal where they're just like, yeah, I'm just like not liquid, or you basically know, and you can like adjust and change dates or do something, or create a bigger window for money to come in, so that you don't get the surprise of, wait, why isn't round closed, right? Because what you don't want is these rounds that just stay open, and then you have problems. There are things that go wrong and things you don't communicate in terms of progress, and things that upset investors, and sometimes under adverse situations, people pull term sheets. So you have to like make sure people are good and you're checking in with them, and that's part of the communication as well. So there's a number of things, but as you can see, like what it comes down to is just knowing what needs to be done, what are the main things and main events and dates, and over communicating and checking in with people to make sure it all goes smoothly.
Definitely. So it's all about communication. That's fantastic. Well, now that we've gone through all, four parts of the funding framework, Vijay, thank you so much for hopping on the show. This has been wonderful. This is just a small snippet of your book, but I'm more than certain that after this episode, we're going to get a lot of listeners interested in the book. So I'll put the info in the show notes, and it'll also be in the outro as well. But once again, thank you so much for your time. I really
Pleasure,
appreciate
Zaki.
you.
And thank you for everything that you do, really bringing this whole world down to earth, and humanizing it and making it as accessible as possible for student founders.
Of course, I really appreciate that high praise, especially coming from you. Thank you so much, Vijay. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You too. Take care.
Bye bye. All right, that wraps up this episode of Dorman Ventures. Huge thanks to Vijay for joining us and sharing his insights on the funding framework for student founders. Per usual, before we close out, here are 4 takeaways to remember, one for each of the stages of the funding framework. So first, for storytelling, is all about the idea of authenticity, right? Authentic storytelling is huge in this day and age, especially when you have a pool of people who are all trying to be copy and paste of one another. Authentic storytelling is crucial for student founders, and it's about explaining why you're doing something and why it matters. Additionally, how it's tied to who you are as a person uniquely. This connection makes your story memorable and grabs attention, which, at the end, sets you apart in the eyes of investors. For organization, a huge key takeaway is content preparation. Effective fundraising starts with being prepared. Have a variety of materials ready, like slide decks and data room assets, to support different stages of the fundraising process. This preparation ensures you're ready to engage with investors really at any point. Next, for outreach, is the idea that warm intros beat cold outreach any day, right? Building genuine connections is key. Aim for warm introductions through existing networks or trusted referrals rather than relying on cold outreach. This approach builds trust and opens doors to meaningful investor relationships. And the last key takeaway for the last section, closing, is communication, right? Successful closing hinges on clear communication. Over-communicate with investors to avoid surprises and ensure a smooth closing process. Managing timelines and expectations is crucial to closing your funding round successfully. All right, that's all the key takeaways. Thank you guys once again very much for tuning in. If this episode helped you think differently about fundraising, share it with a friend and follow along for more stories from the next generation of builders. All right, until next time, this is Dorman Ventures.